Hi, everybody. I'm John from LA Poverty Department, and welcome to one of the hidden resources of Los Angeles, the Box parking lot. It's been discovered as one of the best spots to be, as you can see and feel, with the nice breeze coming through. So I want to thank Mara McCarthy for having us here, and all of the things we've done with Mara McCarthy over many, many years. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit of history. I was just telling Felicia Fowler about, the history of this project a little bit, because this project started out, pre-pandemic, and compassion and self-deception. The idea was, why did the voters of Los Angeles vote for all this housing, and then they didn't want any of it near them. They didn't want temporary solutions near them, and they certainly didn't want people just living unhoused near them either. So then what gives, And initially this project was going to happen at our space, the Skid Row History Museum and Archive, with an exhibition on the wall, and we asked Robby Herbst to do that, and also to make a little map of compassion and self-deception, because he's a socio-mapper extraordinaire. And then the pandemic happened, and so everything changed, and we made this whole piece on Zoom that we did, and we got, plan B was to do it right here in the parking lot. We ended up rehearsing it here. When people got vaccinated, we worked it all out here. So, and then it turned out it happened over at MoCA with We Rise and Art Rise, but the conversations were always part of the project too, and California Humanities is supporting the conversation. So we had one during the MoCA show. We're having this one, and we're going to have more later on in the summer and fall. And I think the next one, there are a bunch of women from Skid Row who have been working, who wrote an amicus brief around the Judge Carter lawsuit. And I think we're going to do a panel with those women later on in the summer, because they did a really good job of explaining how the connections between people in Skid Row make a community, and you can't just be like sundering those and thinking you're doing something good. And so the Mike Kelly Foundation has also been a supporter of the project, all of it. And so anyway, we're going to do a little excerpt from the performance with Lorraine Moreland and Tom Grody. And then Michael Alexander is going to take over and bring up our panelists. And the only sad news we have to report is that Pastor Q is in deep pain. He had 2 wisdom teeth removed yesterday, and he called about 2 hours ago to say that his fever and hallucinations and pain are like making him unable to be here. So anyway, we're going to, plan A, plan B, plan C, pas problem. Okay, here we go.
So welcome everyone. We've got cookies and punch, and we have some speakers coming up. And our next speaker is around the corner having a smoke. Okay, that's not a problem. We'll just play some music for a minute. So help me out here. They're homeless. They've experienced homelessness. They've got an apartment now. So let's give ourselves a musical interlude. And so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Humility. Humility. Okay, that's your bass line. Just keep it going on the back of your head. Humility. Okay, that's it. Just keep it going. You're walking down the street, saying hello to the people you meet. Some have makeup, some have smiles. Some look through you like you're not even real. Humility. 1, 2, 3.
You wake up in the morning, you look in the mirror, your eyes rise and you meet yourself.
Humility. 1, 2, 3.
You do or you don't like what you see. Humility or shame is the name of the game.
Humility. 1, 2, 3.
You look to the sky and the clouds moving by, and you rise up, you rise.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 4.
And you say to yourself, what a wonderful world.
Thank you, Louis Armstrong. What a wonderful world.
Refreshing.
In one word.
Refreshing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Psychic.
Okay, I'd like to invite the panel up. Have a seat. My name is Mike.
Sorry, I'm late.
Oh, Lee's here. Now we can start.
Oh, y'all want to do James Brown now?
We're just going to warm them up for you. Then you can come on out and do. Yeah, you know. I know you. So I'm Michael Alexander. I am faculty in religious studies at the University of California, Riverside, and I have been an admirer of LAPD for now decades and have gone to many shows and participated in archival events and artistic events, and I'm very glad to be able to participate here today. So let me introduce everybody. First I'm going to start by introducing Robby Herbst, who really is the brains behind the operation and the reason that we're here. So as you heard before from John, Robby was initially going to do a presentation and an exhibit at the museum itself, but then COVID came, and then for that reason he ended up creating for us the seventh of 7 guides that he has put together about the city of Los Angeles, and this one is entitled A Guide to Los Angeles' Moral Crisis. And as part of this, if you've had a chance to read it or should grab it on the way out, part of this was an interview with 3 spiritual and community leaders. And we have 2 of those leaders here today. Unfortunately, Pastor Q is not able to be here today. But we have interviews here from, let's go from my right. We have Matt Harper, who is an organizer for the Catholic Worker Collective, former faculty at St. Pius X Parish School, but that was some years ago. And then currently you're involved with White Lives for, what's the name of the organization?
White People for Black Lives.
White, that's good.
All lives matter. I like that.
And a really fantastic interview here in the guide. And then next to Matt, we have Rabbi Aryen Cohen, who is faculty at the American Jewish University and received his smicha, his rabbinical ordination from that institution, also a PhD from Brandeis in rabbinic studies, and is the author of Justice in the City, an argument from the sources of rabbinic Judaism. So today we just want to, I've been talking to John and Henriette for years about the possibility of speaking about the connections between spirituality and the spiritual senses. and the work that needs to be done for poverty and in the city, in our city. And so I was very pleasantly surprised to see this guide put together by Robby, specifically incorporating those elements. So if we could start just by asking Robby, what sort of, when you saw compassion and self-deception and were conceiving of a project to go along with this, what did make you sort of decide to speak to spiritual leaders and also community leaders?
That's a hard question to answer, but yet it's easy. So John said that I was a mapping master, but I'm an artist, and I claim no map skills, though I think about space. And when we first began to talk about this, I started to think about the question, how do you map feelings on a landscape? If we're talking about compassion and self-deception, this like kind of moral territory, how can you visualize how a city feels? And some of you may know the Situationist International made these psychogeographic maps of France that were Paris, and tried to get people to imagine the city as a place of sensations and to get people to wander and to feel the city as it was as architecture, not as a phenomenon of capitalism. So that concept of a psychogeographic mapping is kind of contained on the cover of the publication, which is born from basically situationist mapping. But the truth be told, in order to be able to kind of imagine mapping the emotions of a city or the feelings of the city, I don't have the ability to do that. I'm not a researcher, and I could probably have hired like a computer programmer to find an algorithm to do like a deep dive into tweets that were geographically cited around LA, and to like tag certain words to map certain emotional characteristics that people relate to the city. I'm not going to do that. So I kind of just started to think about feelings and how it is that we understand our feelings is through, largely, in my understanding, and how we judge feelings is through morality and ethics. And that's how I got there.
Okay, so we have this unique opportunity. I'm sorry, I'm not sure this is up.
Oh, there we go, a little bit closer. Okay, so I actually intend not to do much talking and to do mostly question asking. But when I was asked to introduce this topic and to say some words of introduction, immediately a parable came to mind that I learned many years ago. I'm a little bit embarrassed repeating it in front of Rabbi Cohen, because he's actually an expert in Jewish rabbinic literature, but this is actually a parable from a contemporary Syrian Jewish community that I learned about fairly recently. So just like there are parables that, it was the form that Jesus used the most frequently, so rabbinic Jews used the form of a parable in order to tell stories that were bigger than the story that was being explicitly said. And so there is a mashal is what it's called, a mashal shel ha-melech, or mashal shel melech. There is a story of a king. And so in this version of the parable of a story of a king, it's actually a story of a person, a common person, who desperately wanted to be in the presence of the king, but had no opportunity to do so being a common person. And so every day when they finished their drudgery and work, they would get on they would get themselves to the palace in the hope of seeing the king as they exited the royal chariot and scurried into the palace. And so this common person would go to the palace every day, and perhaps on one day he would catch a glimpse of the chariot, and then the king without even being seen, would get into the palace, and that was the end of the vision in the presence of the king. Maybe the next day he would catch the trail of the king's cape, but that would be the end of it. Maybe on the next day he would see just a glimmer of the back of the head of the king. Finally, one day, a valet for the king sees this common person coming by every day in an attempt to be in the presence of the king. And the valet says to this common person, "What are you trying to do?" And the person says, I have this need and desire to be closer to the king. And the valet says, "Well, I have to tell you that I think you're going about it all wrong. Tomorrow, this is what I'm going to tell you to do. Come by and come work in the palace. If you start to work in the palace, you're going to see the king every day. And if you do your job right, there are times in which the king will call you by name." Now, the folks at this table and many of the folks out there have been working for the king for a long time. And it's hard work. But the benefit of it is that eventually, sometimes, you hear your name called. So I want to ask folks that have been doing this work for a long time and really dedicated their lives to this important work, when they hear the words compassion and they hear the word self-deception, to give us some sense of what that means to them in the context of the city and what the city needs to be better. So if I'm going to ask each one of them, I guess starting on my right with Matt and then going over to Arya and then going over to Robby, if you can provide for us either a definition, if you can or want to, of compassion, or an example that you have seen in your years that really strikes you as important of compassion, or perhaps an episode in your own life experience in which compassion was an important moment. If you could talk to us and open up the conversation in that way, that would be very helpful. And then just not so that you're not tricked, the next question would be, of course, have there been elements of self-deception that you have seen and witnessed and can really help us understand? Because it really is, as John and Henriette have conceived so brilliantly in this compassion and self-deception, it's a real problem. It's a very real problem. The desire and the want isn't always sufficient. So if we could start. Matt, that would be great.
Thank you for that question. I want to start by just naming, I always feel my smallness in spaces like this, and that there are many voices and perspectives that are important and missing. So I hold that I am one lens in one story, for whatever that is worth. And a definition feels daunting because it feels so definitive, so I will share a story. I grew up in the northeast part of Los Angeles, La Cañada, right next to Pasadena, where affluence and privilege and smallness was a frequent part of our lives, and the way we were taught, the way I felt called to engage with the world outside of my bubble was through charity, through a recognition that I had things that I could share with others, often from a physical, economic standpoint. And when I started working on Skid Row, I had a lot of savior complex, a lot of guilt, a lot of shame that led me to want to be in a community of folks who I recognized were getting the shortest end of the stick possible. And fast forward a number of years, I had a dear friend of mine who grew up with me, who shares a story and identities and experiences similar to my own, who, as he got older, his mental health struggles started coming to the forefront in really serious ways. He lost his job and jobs, he lost relationships, and he came to me one day and he said, you know, if I didn't have the support of my family and friends, something that a lot of my privileged identities still afford, I'd either be coming through your soup kitchen line or in Men's Central Jail, because that's where people who have what I have end up. And it made me realize, when I think of compassion, that experience, that relationship reminded me that I have fooled myself into thinking I am safer than I am, that I am more stable than I am, that nothing could possibly happen to put me in a place where my needs weren't being met. And for me, when I think about compassion, it's a recognition that a threat to any single one of us is the threat to every single one of us. Because just as someone is being thrown away today, it could be anyone tomorrow. And so compassion is less about charity, is less about ego, but more about a recognition that if we are not in this together, if we are not with each other, the forces at work will do their damnedest to cause pain and to cause harm. And I have a lot to learn and a lot to grow in, and so I will end by just saying compassion is that recognition that I have a personal stake in a different world, and I sure as hell want to be a part of building it.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts?
So I'm going to be a bit of a bummer. I think there's an integral connection between compassion and self-deception. Sometimes compassion is actually the problem. Not that compassion is bad in and of itself. Compassion literally is feeling together, empathy. So what does that mean? You walk down the street, see somebody who's living on the street, somebody who's houseless, talk to them, give them something to eat, buy them a meal, and then what happens? Then you feel good about yourself. I just solved the problem of homelessness. Right? That's where compassion becomes self-deception, right? I remember, once I took a bus of folks down to, I'm sorry that Pastor Q's not here because he was there, took a busload of folks down to Skid Row for the purpose of being overwhelmed. People don't live anywhere near Skid Row, don't live in both geographically and socioeconomically don't live anywhere near Skid Row. And before going there, spent a lot of time, both myself, other folks, talking about why there is a houselessness problem in one of the richest cities in the world, what drives that, how it could be solved, why that doesn't happen, and then brought them to Skid Row. It was part of one of the Jewish holidays is Purim, and on Purim one of the practices is called Matanot Levyonim, which is gifts to the poor. Purim is basically, if you know about it, it's a party day. It's kind of upside down day. Everybody wears masks, and it's actually from the biblical book of Esther. It's one of those holiday stories where they try to kill us, they didn't, let's party, right? And so, but Purim is actually in a deeper level about confronting what happens if there's no redemption. And so there are two major practices aside from reading the scroll. One is to actually have a party and to exchange gifts with friends. And the other one is to exchange gifts with people who can't afford it so that they could also enjoy the day. And so for Purim, we took a busload of folks down to Skid Row. And as well as I could, I said, when you go out on the street on San Pedro, engage with people, talk to people. You're not doing anything to solve a problem. What you're doing is meeting people. And my agenda was that they would be overwhelmed by what was going on the street. Be overwhelmed by the number of houseless people. And still, on the bus coming back, I overheard conversations about how good they felt about helping people, right? And that's where compassion becomes self-deception, because the problem is structural. I think it's actually really important to give money or to give food to people for the following reason. The reason is to remember that they're part of our community. They are part of our city, because at the center of the city there's a contradiction. and the contradiction which threatens to undermine, to deconstruct the notion of city. People come to city in order to be able to kind of, when cities were created, people come together in order to be able to share skills and to afford shelter, so that not everybody has to make bread and not everybody has to, milk cows, right? Not everybody has to be a carpenter. To share skills, and in a city, a houseless person, and there are amazing communities of houseless people, but a houseless person is not protected in the way that cities were designed to protect people. And so there's a very deep way in which houseless people don't live in a city. And the contradiction at the heart of the city is that the rest of us want to ignore that. We like our city. We enjoy all the cultural riches. We enjoy the amazing things about the city. The fact that it's 20 degrees cooler at night than it is during the day. That we didn't have anything to do with, but, right? But, so at the heart of the self-deception is that, well, we live in a city and there are great things about it, so what can you do? There are also people who are houseless, people who are poor, people who can't afford to live. But those two things are not, one is not dependent on the other. We deceive ourselves to say, in order to have this cultural richness, in order to be able to do this stuff, there have to be people who are at the bottom of the ladder. That's the self-deception. We need compassion, a radical type of, I don't like the word compassion, but since that's the word that was offered, a radical type of compassion, a radical empathy, which undermines the self-deception, which undermines our ability to look ourselves in the mirror. That's what I think we need.
All right, I'm sure. Yes.
It's challenging to follow that up, but I'll just enter myself with empathy. For me, I'll just piggyback off of that. I encounter compassion the most when I am really present with the communities that I find myself in, whether that's as a teacher, whether that's as a neighbor, or whether that's a community of creatives, and to really try to move towards the place of embracing everyone that I encounter in all those worlds with as much understanding and patience and giving to the people that I find myself encountering. There's something very day-to-day about that. And that's striking, honestly. As a teacher, your job is to care for the life of a young person in a way that you're giving them hope, and you're giving them that you believe in them. And it's the same, with the community of educators that you're with. You're there because you have a vision of a better world and a better place, and that you believe by making a community like that and believing that mythology and sharing that with others that could happen. And as someone who makes community wherever I go, and in an expanded mindset of the city, in my neighborhood where I live, I extend the concept of compassion to everyone who, owns a house there, and people who don't have a house there, and people who walk through it, and people who might be living on the street there. And yes, well, that's enough to say.
Okay, great. So, does anybody want to speak on the issue? Rabbi Cohen already spoke about both self-deception as well. Do either of you want to speak on the experiences with self-deception or some comments about it?
I'll just briefly.
Yeah, please.
Through tragedy, we were gifted a moment of reckoning last year, where people had to look, where white folks like myself had to look at the reality of racism in this world. And we are now a year later. Where are we? What are we doing? Where are we placing ourselves? Tonight at midnight, the encampment in Venice Beach is going to be cleared out. by the sheriffs, who have been taking people's information for the last weeks so that they know their information before they're picked up. They have beds, jail beds, to put them into if they refuse to leave, if they refuse to accept the services that don't exist, that they promise, that will never materialize. And I come from communities that say, well, why don't they just go there? These communities have been telling us for years, there's nothing at the end of that road. And so when I think about this notion of self-deception, Los Angeles, and I think it's important to name the systemic dimension of these problems, but yeah, we paint this narrative of our town, and yet with the resources to be able to resolve these issues, do not resolve them, and in fact, profit off of all of these things. And so I think I have to constantly acknowledge my complicity with the things around, while also acknowledging the systemic dimensions that are beyond my individual capacity to change. And I think this notion of self-deception, what is the truth I believe so I can live my comfortable life? In the movement I'm a part of, the Catholic worker movement, there was a priest who continued to get arrested during the Vietnam War for protests. He burned draft cards, they tried to break military equipment, and someone said, "You have children. Shame on you for spending all of this time incarcerated." And his response was, "My children are no more valuable than the children in Vietnam." And I hope that we don't deceive ourselves into thinking that the life next to us is not as important as our own and our families. And that's a radical thing, and I'm not there yet, but I hope each day is a chance for all of us to get closer and break down that self-deception.
So I think, I deceive myself all the time, but I think the self-deception that I think is just worth noting, which Matt just brought up, is the political class in this city. I'm just like, how the fuck does Mitch O'Farrell think that anything that he does is not in his own interest? So for me, just spending time with this project was just really just meditating on the hubris of the politicians in the city. I think, and I bring that up just to say that while I might deceive myself, and yes, an individual is powerful, but there are bigger, more powerful people deceiving themselves in more dangerous ways. That's all I want to say.
Could I add one?
Yeah, please.
Take a second bite of the apple. I actually wanted to compliment, I don't know, what do we call this?
The guide.
The guide, thank you, yes. Compliment the guide because on the front of it there's a map, and that map, and I think that that's actually really important. I think the cartography of the city, just in the sense of thinking beyond where we are, that we are part of a city. Right? And it's very easy to be part of a neighborhood or part of a block or even just part of the house. And there's a wonderful practice, Jewish practice, that when somebody comes over to your house as a guest, you walk them out of the house. Right? You have to walk them out a certain amount. But the point of the practice is to remind yourself that we are not bound just by our home, just by our hearth. We are part of a larger city, and things we do impact everybody else, right? Like you were saying, Robby. And so we have to keep that in mind, right? If I'm living in West LA, Skid Row is my fault. I mean, I am complicit in what's going on in Skid Row. I am complicit in what the police are doing. As long as I live in this city, I am complicit in what's going on, unless I am actively trying to undo it. And that's why the map is really important, because near me there's a monument on the corner of Olympic and Bedford, I think it is, and the monument is to those brave people who kept Beverly Hills as its own municipality. And there's a list there of all the Golden Age actors, right? And what did they do? They kept the tax base of Beverly Hills so that it couldn't be touched by the needs of the city that surrounded them, in which there was great need. Right? And it's those kind of things that this kind of a map reminds us is wrong. So thank you for that.
Right, that does seem like an act of colossal self-deception. So first of all, for folks that want to either contribute their own thoughts or experiences, please, we can do that at any time. Or if you have questions, we can do that at any time. I'll start with sort of an initial question, but please, get limbered up and please do participate. So Arya, you don't like the word compassion. I know that the title of your work is Justice in the City. Is that a term that you prefer? And did I guess that correctly? And why?
So I like justice because justice is making a claim on us. It's making it. I think that compassion oftentimes leads to self-deception, as I said. But compassion can also be good. I mean, I think there is compassion. The problem with empathy and compassion is that oftentimes we are tricked into thinking that we know what's better for another person, right? And so even though radical empathy is actually a good thing, but oftentimes I am driven by my empathy to think that I know what you need. And then as Matt said, the whole white savior complex, I know how to save you. Justice says that we have to try to figure out how everybody gets their share of resources, how everybody gets their share of good, all right, of the goods of the city. And that's why I think that justice is important. Justice also, I have to, it's kind of a baseline to look at what should be happening in the city in terms of who is at the table, who is, whose interests and needs are being taken care of when we have budget meetings, when we have, who is the city council taking into account and who are they not? So that's why I think that's why I like justice.
Yeah. So I do wonder if Matt and Robby also are driven by senses of justice. If that comes up in your, you definitely get a sense of kind of righteous anger, and in the interviews, and in the kind of righteous irony in some of these guides, that is for which compassion does not seem to be the appropriate affect that's being risen, but a sense of justice, or injustice rather, does seem. So does that play how does that play a part? It's just coming to mind that in the Kabbalah, I may have this right or I may not have this right, I may be making this up, but that justice and compassion. A Kabbalist needs to be 40 years old in order to study the Kabbalah, the medieval Jewish mysticism. And Arya just claimed that he's not old enough to be a Kabbalist. But as I remember it, that the aspects of God of justice and compassion are in fact Gevura and Chesed are balanced. So I wonder if that's at play here. Robby.
Let's chime in quickly. I don't necessarily have a conception of justice in my work. I'm more kind of moving through materials and arriving where I arrive. That is to say, probably at my core, there is a sense of justice, but I don't know if that's always right in front of my eyes.
I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to understand the things I've begun to see. I'm not supposed to trust the people I've begun to trust to tell their stories. And compassion was something that got me there, so I hold it as a gift in my journey. I hope justice is my aim, and I hope my means get me there, which probably involves me talking less and listening more. But I think about, there are so many things that move people and bring people into this work, and really feeling the responsibility of, I have a community that I come from historically that are my people to move and to be with and to support, and whatever brings people in, is a starting point and a gift. But yeah, I hope justice is my North Star. I hope it is what gets me up in the morning and what shuts me up at places like this.
So are any folks interested in asking questions or giving their own, some sense of their experiences of what motivates them to do the work that they do or would like to do? Please, should we give microphones here?
We don't have the extra.
Okay.
I'm proud.
Can you stand up that everybody can hear though? Because
Yeah. Okay. Here.
Okay, hi, my name is Aryen Cohen, and I work with Los Angeles Poverty Department, Street Symphony, Urban Voices Project, with Maxine Sealy, with the Beagle Union Project Sanctuary, with probably about 10 different families. And I've been able to give out 800 bags of groceries every week. I give out 350 hot meals with Maxine Sealy. But what I'm finding is that divided, we will fall. But united, not only will we stand tall, we will have the numbers to outpower. And we can actually make the changes that we need to see change. We can be the changes we wish to see changed in Skid Row. We can bring better tomorrows to Skid Row. But they keep us divided. Little Tokyo against Chinatown. Chinatown against Skid Row. Black against white. Yellow against orange. Brown. And so when it comes time to vote, we lose constantly. $10 billion in AAA spending. Gone. There are so much money that's coming in for housing. They want to build housing in Skid Row, but they don't want to have the people live in Skid Row. They want to move the homeless somewhere else. They want to take all the people out of the parks and just give them into a project room key. But then that's only going to be temporarily. That doesn't last. So now that beautiful community that they have had, that love of sharing is gone. What can we do to keep the unity of our communities together so that we fight to end homelessness? Because that's got to be our goal. One heart, one body, one soul, one goal to end homelessness in LA. But the only way we can do that is if we are united, if we stand together, if we stop our prejudices, stop all our racial discrimination, and we stand together with justice, we can then get rid of all the injustices that have been happening. I don't have a place where I can go, a resource where I can say, this is what we need to vote on. This is what we need to do. This is what we can do to get these things changed. What do you think we can do to bring all these communities together? The black, the white, the yellow, the red, the orange, all of us, so that we have the numbers, because we have the numbers. When Martin Luther King was just fighting for the blacks, they left him alone. As soon as he brought the whites in, gone. The Kennedys, the same way. As soon as anybody brings people together, somehow they're extinguished. And I see that happening all the time. They laser target a lot of the black members. When they start working with the white communities, they end up going in jail. They target their families. They target everything around them, all their communities, because they want to keep us divided. They want us to fall. I'll leave it to you from there. I know it's a big question.
Iron triggered me in my response. I don't think I operate out of justice because for me that's I think about justice in legal terms. But I think as an artist I primarily, and maybe that gets to the irony that you see in the work and in other of my work, moral clarity is really important to me. And having the ability to stand in a position where you feel clear about what you have to say. And as an artist, making work that is political, I go more towards moral clarity because I feel like that's a place where I could play around with, as opposed to justice. But I don't know if they're in oppositions, but I'm certainly, moral clarity seems like a place where I like to operate from because you know your position, and from that you could just play around with your modes of speech and your modes of representation. Whereas if you're going from a place of justice, I feel like I'm trying to have a legal argument. And I don't know if that's how the rabbi uses the word justice, but for me, it's moral clarity is a place where I could be in and then just fuck off with language or fuck off with tone and just be creative from there.
I just say on that yeah, I think that justice is a legal term in a good way. In the sense that, I mean, there's the difference between, sometimes I think about the difference between justice and liberation. A lot of folks in the movement like to use the word liberation. But justice is, and it is legal in the sense that, in the following sense, that it's material. It's cashed out, right? The Talmudic rabbis get a bad rap because basically they spent their whole day splitting hairs about all kinds of, and I'm saying this out of love. I spend most of my days reading these texts, and so but the thing I get from that is that the rabbis have no patience with people who say every person who comes to the city and doesn't have what to eat has to be given, has to be supported. They have no patience with that. Unless you say how much you're going to give them, who's going to give them, whose obligation is it to give them. That's what justice is. And I think that, one of the ways to answer your question, I mean, it's a very large question, it's a very small answer, but our thinking in our legal tradition is a rights-based thinking. Rabbinic tradition is an obligation-based thinking. And the two are not the opposite, they're not two sides of a coin. If I have a right to housing, I have to demand that right from somebody. And unless I can figure out who that somebody is, I can take that right and sleep on the street. If the city has an obligation to house people, then anybody comes and says, I'm unhoused, give me a house. And that's a shift in thinking. I'm not sure, that's a very large shift in thinking. But I think that's the way to, rather than working on a rights-based understanding of houselessness, work on an obligation-based.
Oh, wow.
So I have two thoughts. One is, when it comes to the legal city obligation side, I turn to people like Los Angeles Community Action Network, who are made of the people who know the answers that I can't possibly know, people who have lived the experience, people who know what they need, and an organization who will build people power and fight for the rights in our systems of government. The Catholic worker movement was based off of the notion that we will wait until eternity for systems to give people what they deserve, and that we have a moral obligation to do what we can in our place. So we run a house of hospitality for folks who don't have stable housing, and we run a soup kitchen because we believe if you have some extra beds in your room that are empty while people sleep on the streets, that is sinful, and that if you have the capacity to feed people and you don't, that's sinful, even though we know that food is not solving the problem. And I identify, and we're part of this movement called the Catholic Worker Movement. The Catholic Archdiocese of Los Angeles has roughly 6 million Catholics in it. That means that if we wanted to end homelessness tomorrow, we could do it. Every 90 Catholics could take one human being and say, come into your home, you are welcome here, stay here. Now that won't resolve the legal side, and we need to deal with how our government has money and things, but this notion of the obligation feels so real for me. And it begins with relationship, begins with getting to know people and hearing their stories, and hopefully it's both and with always the lens on how are we accountable to those who are most impacted, because otherwise it's easy to be self-deceiving ourselves on what we're doing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Come on.
Basically what he said that the Catholic territory. So I'm
You're getting in front of the mic. Have a seat.
Oh, we can hear.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah. I can relate to that because two things I want to talk about is compassion, which I really didn't know anything about compassion. I always heard compassion was a sex thing. Make love compassionately. And compassionately, I read in books, nothing but passion, about sex. It wasn't about helping somebody. And I had to figure out what was compassion. I start hearing it. I just start really basically hearing it. But I remember when I was homeless and I was sleeping on 3rd and Alvarado, and this lady would come, and she had this bag full of food for me, like eggs and pancakes. And back in the 80s, I didn't too much know about a microwave oven. So I was trying to figure out, how is this food so hot when she brings it to me, you know? But she didn't know me. This lady did not know me. I just saw a tall lady with red hair, because I'd be half asleep when she leave it there. And when Christmas came, I had a Christmas tree and Christmas presents under there. And even today, when I think about compassion, I don't know if she was being compassionate to me. She was just caring and making a point. She had a good heart or something. I still think about it today, even when I hear compassion. Was that really compassion? Because compassion is something you have to embrace. It just don't go to you. It's something that you embrace and you give it out. But you have to be willing to do that. And then when he said, so when this nun saw me in my doorway. And that's why I'm here today after 27 years clean and sober. Because when I went to the shelter, the nun, Sister Mary Murphy, said, she saw me in my doorway and it was raining. And when I got to the shelter, she said, I saw you. She said, no matter what I do today, you're not sleeping on the streets anymore. So they had to call around to alcohol centers, because I was an alcoholic, because you couldn't go to sleep on the streets without being drunk or something, because it was a nightmare. So they called the women's center, ACW. The lady said, well, we don't have a bed for her today. She can come tomorrow. So I was going to go out and get my last drink for $1.39, because I knew I was going to be going to this place, but the lady came, and the lady called and said she could come today. So I never really actually made it out the door. But I remember how they sent me to the program, and I graduated and everything, and they stuck with me. They just didn't throw me in there and say, you're on your own now. She kept coming and coming. And I feel today that's compassion. That's a compassion fired up to ignite someone's soul, to really feel the rock of Sabra, to be able to stand and be strong, because that's what I needed. And so the program said you have to go to school or something, so I went to USC and became a volunteer social worker. And then I said, I want to work at that shelter that helped me. And so I worked there. I worked there 15 years. And the thing about it, what I found out, what I feel about what they're talking about, is that you have to have compassion within you. It can't be outside to come in a part where you don't really grasp it. It has to be built in you by others helping you. So you'll know that compassion takes baby steps to grow into a beautiful flower, and you don't give up on it. And that's what I did, because every time a woman walked in that door, that shelter, that was me walking in that shelter all over again. Right. So it wasn't like I had to work like you have to, they say you have rules and regulations you have to do to treat people, but sometimes you got to go a little extra mile up on your own. And since I have already been homeless in a doorway for 8 years, I knew that I didn't want to go back there, and I didn't think the women that was coming in that door wanted to go back out there either. So I had to love them and nourish them. You know, like the nun said, I'll quit with this. She said, and this, I'm saying this to remember, when you go out to reach out somebody, don't do it once, keep going. Make sure that person is strong enough to endure what you're trying to give them, because if you don't, it's going to be a waste of your time. So the nun said, don't give this away too many, because you'll spoil them. Oh, so the girl came in the kitchen. She said, Lorraine, can you make me a sandwich? It's Friday. And I made her big sandwich with lettuce and tomatoes and stuff, because some people just throw stuff on the sandwich, but I wanted her to have a long one. I'm thinking she can keep it for the whole weekend, you know. And she said, can I have a hug too? And I gave her a big old hug in the kitchen, in the door of the kitchen. And she was so happy. I mean, I can still see her face today. So I go back to work on Tuesday, and they told me that she got killed by her ex-boyfriend. And can you imagine, when she asked me for that sandwich and that hug, and I didn't give it to her, you think I could be standing up here today? No, I wouldn't have been able. I would have died right along with her, because that would have been so selfish of me. When people donate food and give clothing and stuff for the homeless, I have no right to judge it, but to give it to my best of my ability. So when you talk about compassion, compassion is something that it don't come flying to you. It's something you embrace. And compassion is something you share. And you won't know that it ignite until you see it blossom. That's what compassion is. That's my opinion. But I see it in so many people. I see it in so many people's faces right now. And you have beautiful compassion. And you don't ever have to stop giving because somebody, oh, they're going to go use it for drugs. They're going to have to do this. Don't let people tell you what other people are going to do when you're reaching out to somebody. Because we have an Almighty that watches over us all. And that's why we're here. That's why I like Barbra Streisand. People need people. We can't do this alone. We just can't do it alone. We need help. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine.
That's exactly. Yeah.
Good stuff. Anybody else want to participate? Robby, do you have any questions? You know, since you really did conceive of this whole thing and you sort of called the meeting, do you have, you know, things that you want to make sure get said?
No, I think we're going through it.
Okay, great. Okay, just making sure.
Yeah.
I'm very taken by this concept of obligation that has been coming up almost through all the speakers. The interior feeling that one ought to be doing something. And so frequently this turns into something like self-deception. Especially, I'm not as familiar with the bond measures as some of you are, but I do know that the people of the city have voted in billions of dollars, and then it ends up going nowhere. And I am reminded that from one of our speakers here, you spoke of Dr. King. Part of the genius, there was a number of elements of the civil rights movement under his leadership that was genius. But one of the things that was really of practical genius was his realization that he needed to help white people become part of the solution. Yes. Right? And that they could not just alienate white people because there are just too many of them, us. There are too many of us. And so they needed to be brought in to be part of the solution. And one does get a sense that a lot of people do feel obligation to do something, but we haven't been brought in a sense, to know the right way to become part of the solution. So that I do wonder if you have thought about the city for a long time, have thoughts about helping transpose those who would like to be on the right side, but often find themselves on the wrong side.
So in the organizing work that I do, one of the grounding questions that tries to be at the center of what we do is, where is your community calling you to leadership? I think it's really important to be clear on our definition of your community. When I came back to Los Angeles, I'd lived abroad for a while, and it was really hard to be amongst the community that I came from. I'd felt some moral superiority. I was somewhere down the road that some of the folks in my community were not, and I created this dichotomy of them versus us. And then it became clear to me one day that I'm only here because someone else has invested time and energy to get me there. I would not have gotten here on my own. And so when I think I spent all this time away from these spaces, away from communities that look and live like me, this question of where is my community calling me to leadership, the responsibility I have and the opportunities that I have are to those who, white men like myself, where are we in social movements? How are we wielding the power that society gives to us? How are we showing up in our relationships? And so part of the work that we do is around building community and building networks that provide spaces for education and encounter and activism, recognizing that we can spend the rest of our lives doing the personal work that feels safe, reading a book, joining a book club, watching some videos. But at the end of the day, our community is calling us to transformation, but also to a different world. And so I think, this question of, what does that look like for me and my community? We run a soup kitchen to meet the immediate needs of people on Skid Row, but the reality is the most important thing that I think we probably do, besides building relationship and listening to the stories of those downtown, is bringing folks into encounter opportunities. We run a soup kitchen on Saturdays not because there's not food on Skid Row, but because most of the people who will come and volunteers work 9 to 5 on Monday through Fridays. And this is an opportunity where we can hopefully create a space of care and encounter that opens doors for transformation, opens doors for tough conversations that's ours to have and not those who are coming and eating in our soup kitchens to have with folks. And so, I think there's a constant invitation for any of us to recognize where do I get to move with credibility, where do I have power that I can wield, but also, who are my people to gather? And so those are some of the questions and ideas that pop up.
So, Martin Luther King's last campaign was the Poor People's Campaign. And Reverend Barber and a whole lot of other people are picking it up. And the central insight of the campaign was that there are poor people who are white, who are black, who are brown, who are Asian, and instead of that being something that's common, instead of that being something that unites them, they're divided by other things. So W.E.B. Du Bois writes in Black Reconstruction about why poor whites in the South supported the Civil War, supported the Confederacy. Supported the Confederacy. They didn't have a plantation. They didn't own plantations. They didn't own enslaved people. But they were convinced by those who owned the plantations that if enslaved people were allowed to be free, their lot in life was worse. And this is the logic of white supremacy, that you can't get up unless somebody else is down. You can't get up unless you walk on top of somebody else. And so solidarity is something that is inimical to the logic of white supremacy. And so the Poor People's Campaign is basically saying that there are poor people. Poverty is not an issue that respects race. Poverty is an issue that affects people across the board. And the only people that poverty respects is the 1%, to go back to Occupy LA. But poverty is the only thing that will be upended if all the poor people get together, if we all get together to solve the issue of poverty, is that there won't be this massive distinction, this massive disparity in wealth. I do want to say one other thing, and that's about what you were saying, Matt, about who are our people. And my people are the Jewish community, which is a multiracial community also. But it's a community also that has a lot of generational trauma. And the result of generational trauma, people who came here after the Holocaust, people who came here after the revolution in Iran, people who were running and seeking refuge, is an instinct to build walls, to come in and be safe, to see inside. And the impact of that, unfortunately, is not looking outside. So when we've been talking this past year, several years, about whether or not the police keep us safe, or we keep each other safe, and talking about defunding the police. And so people in my community started asking, who will keep us safe if there are no more police? And so I saw it as my role to say, who is us? And we need, and breaking out of generational trauma has to do with the fact that we have to be in solidarity with other communities. And that is what actually is going to keep us safe in the long run, rather than, hopefully, rather than the police keeping us safe, because first of all, they're not. As Matt said about what the sheriff is doing down on the Venice Boardwalk, but about the LAPD being the I don't even know what the adjective is, the killingest police force in the country. So I think that is a leap out of generational trauma, which we have to, we in the Jewish community have to do.
Or Robby, if you have some further comment.
Yeah, I just want to say that artists generally don't think beyond themselves. What Llano del Rio, this group of people who, there's a member right in front of me, Aaron Schneider, in that fantastic striped outfit. What we like to do is we like to imagine that the artist community is infinite, and that the artists really do expand the idea of the city. And I don't know where I'm going with this. You both touched something off that I did want to just talk about this last project that we did. It is about landscape, and it's about reimagining the city. And this is a Rebel Cities Los Angeles guide. We have copies available. They're all free. And I think that's what I wanted to say, which is that we create free culture that tries to move beyond the boundaries of what the arts usually is. It's usually inside, except for the box, which is great. And it's singular objects. And what we do is we make multiples, and we try to find different contexts where they could be. Whether they're at a grocery store for someone to see and grab, whether in a bookshop, whether at an event like this, where it's ideas that feed people in multiple occasions and multiple places, and they can encounter it and take it away with them and to sit in it. And Rebel Cities is a guide that kind of imagines the city as if the poor people, the 99%, reverse the order, and they control the levers of power, and it lays out an infrastructure of the city from below, and what are the organizations in the city that are owned by the 99%, and how are they expanding an infrastructure of electricity? How are they expanding an infrastructure of food distribution? How are they expanding an infrastructure of self-governance? So, as someone who likes to spend time thinking about the city and thinking about justice, it is there. I mean, there's a city in waiting to be seen in this thing. It's really just largely for us about who is providing the imagination to see the city as it should be, and how it wants to be, and how it can be. And I think, for me, this current guide was trying to show that there really is a moral infrastructure for another city. like, for some reason, I don't know what our mayor believes is right or wrong. I don't know how Mitch O'Farrell understands the world to be able to go to sleep at night doing the things that he does. When we have like such a powerful moral community in this city that really should be at the center.
Hold up your rebel one more time.
Oh, yeah. If you want these, come and get them at the end.
All right, so we're at time here. John, do you want to say some final words, or should I sort of ask Lee to come up and you do a little this and that, or how do you want to end this?
Jordan, you're not going to close.
Anyway, thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for coming. We have copies of Compassion. Are you coming up, Lee, or are you going to be coy, or are you going to, Oh yeah, all right. You need a microphone?
Not really. I'm known for not needing no microphone.
All right.
Put one on. Y'all want to do one?
Yeah.
Y'all gonna dance with me?
Yeah.
Y'all gonna dance with me?
Yeah.
Put one on, man. Put one on. 'Cause I stay ready. You know that. Okay, let's do it a cappella, okay? Get past the people, get past it, hit back to the Get on down now. Get on down now. Get on, get on, get on, ain't nothing going on. Whole lot of money is bun spit. Ow! And that's on the bag.